didn't start Swallow the Ghost until a number of years after my MFA. I was writing in that time. Um, but yeah, because I had written before I started my MFA, but it was mostly poetry and then a couple stories here and there. And then it wasn't really until the very end of Irvine where I even started trying to write like a novel. And I did write a novel, but that is not Swallow the Ghost. It is how I got my agent though, so it's like it's all like a process. So I started writing Swallow the Ghost. You know what? I don't totally remember. But I think okay, but I started writing it actually I was working on something else and I realized oh, there's this thing I'm trying to do and the story I was working on was not like a good structure for it basically. And so I decided to put that away because I knew, or I thought I knew, that if I kept working on this other thing, I would try to force that to include this thing I wanted, and it wasn't supposed to be in there. So I was just going to step away for a moment and write this story, and then when I got that out of my system, I would come back to the real thing I was working on because I would have tried this thing. And so I wrote the story, which was the story of Jane, which is essentially part one of the book. And um, I was like, oh, I like this, but I don't totally know what to do with it, um, because it was much longer than a story, but it wasn't a novel, and so it was just like falling that weird in between place. And so I sat on it for a while, and then I eventually showed it to um, someone I went to Irvine with, who's still one of my very good friends and first readers, Brendan Park, and he said, "You know what? I think I like this. I think it's part one of something, um, and and I have an idea about part two." And so I got his email, and it was like I never looked back. It was, the Michelle. One of the things, that comes back to you, Michelle says, like, what a good reader can do is get you back into the text. Like, you've read it so many times, you're on the surface, you can't see anything else, and then a good reader will say something and you can get back in, you can get back under, right? And so that's what Brendan's email did. All of a sudden I was like, I, I love this. Okay, I have this idea for part two, and that's Jussie's story. Um and that was really fun to write, especially after writing Jane's section, because the characters are very different and like the structures are somewhat different. Um, for those who don't know, the book is written in like three sections, and there are three different narrators, and there are three different like styles or genre. So when I was writing Jussie's section, which is a like a detective story, I yeah, so that was really fun. And then I got to the third section, was Jeremy's story. Um and that's also in a sort of a different tonal register, a different genre, for lack of a better word. Um and when I was thinking about this book, you know, obviously think about a lot of things, I guess, as we all do. Um but um there were a couple different things that I think I was really interested in. Um, one, like to me, like these three people are all they're trying to they're all trying to figure things out, right? And so, as we all are, and a detective story is very good for that, and but I was thinking also, to start at like a really big level, that meaning is essential to human life, and we either like find it or we make it. And if we make it, also if we find it, but if we make it, the kinds of stories that are around us are like very important. And, there are all these things um, that affect the kinds of stories that are around us. So there's, first of all, there's like genre. So I'm very interested in genre, which comes out in the book. That sort of is like a container for, we have this world and there are all these experiences and sensations and feelings and people. And a genre is a container in some way, a structure in some way that tries to organize or make sense. And, the same thing can happen in a different genre and it'll mean different things. Or the same character can be in different genre and like they might say the same thing, but it will be interpreted differently. So when I was thinking about these people and these characters, um, they're trying to, and stories, it was like, okay, so we have different genres as a structure, and then we have the market that implicates what kind of stories are told, different genres that are more popular, certain stories come in and out of fashion. And then the medium, a novel versus a tweet versus a YouTube video. All of these things have conventions. And if you're sort of growing up at different times and different places, there are stories that are louder, more prevalent, I guess. And so then, and then we have like the internet, that comes in. And it's got its own way of storytelling and it's has its own market implications and limitations. Um, and then within these sort of structures, we have these characters who are, um, trying to make sense of their world through story and trying to make sense of themselves and the people around them through the way they sorry what I was trying to say was if these characters are trying to understand themselves in the world and these disparate things that happen, these experiences, a lot of times they'll sort of narrativize them or try to fit them into a story. And that's implicated by like the larger stories we tell about the world. And so that was something that I was really interested in, was like all of the different stories that are around us and then these characters within that trying to figure out their world. And that seemed really important for um or that seemed to work well with like the structure of a detective story, which has always been one of my favorite kinds of stories. And then I was also thinking about I've always liked thinking of detective stories like anti-detective stories as well. So like Paul Auster and is a big one. And another one is or something that I was thinking about a lot with this is like Rashomon, the Rashomon type of stories, right? Where it's like has come to be known of like there's an event and then depending on who tells it, it looks differently. And it used to be that when there were like 24 episode seasons, like every show had a Rashomon story eventually where like something happens and then you see it from different characters and it all looks different depending on who's telling the story. But in the end, it sort of comes into, you get to see what happened. But in the original, in a Bamboo Grove, which the movie is based on, it actually doesn't work like that. It's the story of this crime, the same one that's in the movie. And there's like 5 or 6 testimonies and they say different things and then it ends. There's like no attempt to resolve it. It just ends. And it's a really interesting reading experience because as you start to read it, you think, aha, I'm picking up, they both said the same thing. So I'm gonna, but you can't, like, it doesn't, in the end, it doesn't come together. Um, and so I thought that was really, first of all, I love that story. And I love the movie too. Um, I like both when they come together and when they don't. But I thought that was really resonated with the internet, of like this experience of, oh, you see something on the internet and then someone says, no, that's not true. And then, and there's this, and then it just kind of like goes away. And you never totally do find out what happened. And like, also upon reflection, you're like, did I care about that? Who were those people, Um, and so that was another thing that I was thinking about. And then with Jeremy's section, the final section, I had this instinct that I wanted it to be a slightly academic tone. And that also came from the internet, of like, I read recently The Covenant of Water, and there's this really lovely moment in that where one of the characters learns to read in English, and they read Moby Dick. And before that in the book, it's like when they think about years, it's like marked a lot by tragedy, like personal tragedy, like the year my father got sick, the year this happened. And then in the book, they say, oh, this year, 1932, maybe, that was the year of Moby Dick. And I love that. And I think about that with the internet, of like how much it's changed this reading process. Of, it's not uncommon now to, there's a text, like there's a movie that comes out or there's a book that comes out and people read it, and then there's like a think piece on the book or the movie, and then there's a Twitter thread about the think piece, and so maybe there's a new think piece about like the Twitter thread, and it goes on and on and on, and there's like this contingency of like, oh, maybe we're not at the final reading yet, like maybe there's something else, and that sort of emphasized, I guess, in the fact that the platforms themselves are kind of unstable. Like Tumblr goes away, like Facebook goes out of fashion, this gets sold to a new billionaire, and they change all the rules, so like there's this this contingency of text that that I thought also that the internet sort of emphasizes. It's sort of always been like that. Like a book is never the same. It's different whoever reads it. The same reader can open the same book 10 years later and it's a different book. That's one of the magical things about reading. But I think the internet sort of emphasizes this. And it really reminded me of Rashomon, of like this sort of like, every time you read it, you become sort of less certain rather than more certain of something.